introduce Dr. Amos Yong for the third time for this third installment of the Hayward Lectures. The purpose of these Hayward Lectures is to stimulate discussion on theology, and I'd say that that's mission accomplished already. Discussion of your work has filled our hallways as we've been chatting about all the ways you have challenged us. In fact, one student even just mentioned how this has caused her to think about the embodied humanity of Christ in all sorts of new ways. That is just such a blessing to this college. In addition to that, we have heard your journey on the red sofa, hearing where you've been, your experiences that have been so formative. Our faculty has been challenged over lunch as we discussed education and the future of the church. And in chapel, we saw your passion for Christ as the way, the truth, and the life. In all these ways, we already are so thankful that you are here with us. And so, again, we want to welcome Dr. Amos Yong for the third installment of this Hayward Lecture. Please join me.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming back. It's been a wonderful week. It's been a great first visit for me to Nova Scotia, to Wolfville, and just to smell the fresh air, feel the fresh air, get a little bit of rain yesterday. It's been a blessing. I'm glad you showed up, even though we had the conclusion over chapel earlier today. And so if you've been following, we've looked at the Pathic on Monday. We looked at the epistemic yesterday. And today we are going to look at the praxeological, the practice dimensions. And I've entitled our next few moments, Messianic Orthopraxis, Navigating Our Social World. Another way to look at as well is Monday we sort of look more at the human inside ourselves, more or less at the level of the person, the individual. Yesterday we looked at our environmental habitation, and today we'll look at our social world. So that's the goal over the next few moments. Jesus is the Messianic and therefore the Anointed One, the Christ, who enables by His Spirit our navigating the social world as well. Today we will spend, there'll be three parts as well to our discussion. We'll start with Jesus passages in the Gospels. Then we will look then also at the book of Acts to see how the Messianic image, the Messianic teachings, the Messianic example, the Messianic footsteps have been followed by the apostles as they navigated the social world of their day. So the three parts will be Jesus and the social, renewing the public square, Jesus and the ethnic other, remixing nations, ethnoi, and cultures, and Jesus and the religious other, remapping the interfaith encounter. So again, each one of these parts will start with some gospel texts, and then we'll look at Acts of the Apostles to see how the earliest followers of Jesus took his example and his teachings and embody them in their way across the Roman Empire, and then we'll come back from that, again, in each part of these to contemporary theological reflections mediated Christologically and, in this case, also apostolically. I think that's a word of some sort. All right. We are not going to be doing there are multiple domains of the social that we all navigate, right? We're going to be talking minimally about the civic dimension of the social. We're going to be talking minimally, probably not at all, about the digital dimension of the social. Although, again, as methodologically how I've been proceeding the last couple of days, we choose some foci, and those foci hopefully can serve as venues for us then to apply a similar methodological approach to engaging with other dimensions or domains as well. All right, so we'll start Jesus in the social, and we'll begin by looking at his sojourn from Capernaum to Nain in Luke chapter 7. The beginning of chapter 7 is the centurion of Capernaum, and I wanted to just highlight a little bit of what is said, what Luke's account is about Jesus' interactions with this centurion, who had a slave whom he valued highly, who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. The centurion obviously had a good enough relationship with the Jewish elders that allowed him to raise the question with them. The Jewish elders, we know now, from that perspective, is probably a wide disparate community in a certain respect, in the sense that some of the Jewish leaders had already begun to saying, he's worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people. It's he who has built our synagogue for us. I also find it interesting that this person, the centurion who had obviously built a relationship with the Jews and they held him in high esteem, had heard enough about Jesus' ministry, heard enough about Jesus' capacities, capabilities of intervening in these sorts of situations. And perhaps also not just heard about, but had found some way to observe Jesus' availability, so that he realized that he could make this request of the Jewish elders to approach Jesus. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word and let my servant be healed. The protocols of the way in which this centurion interacted with, held his position, he applied that in part to the way in which he thought that Jesus was also able to interact based upon his authority and based upon his access to God and to God's healing power. For I'm also a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does this. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him and turned to the crowd that followed him and said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. So here is, in that respect, presence, Jesus' presence in the community, opening up invitations to engage with particular circumstances and situations, Jesus' observing the protocols that of the centurion, responding in part parallel to those protocols, and Jesus being also in that respect receptive of this man's faith, or this man's faith to believe in Jesus' abilities, or in Jesus' compassion and capacity to bring healing to his slave. All right. So obviously the slave received from Jesus' ministry, but Jesus receives from the centurion's witness as well. As he said, not even in Israel have I found such faith. However these relationships were structured, meaning the centurion's relationship with the people, Jesus enters into this space. He works with the existing relational structures and organic relationships in the community, and also at the same time responds in earnest, or to the earnest request of the centurion. And receives the faith of this centurion as one who was outside the religious community, but yet recognized as being even greater than what he had observed in the religious community. So Jesus' again, availability, presence in the public space, and then willingness to interface with a broader public than even what his own immediate community might have opened up to. From this narrative, we then come in verse 11 to the story of the widow of Nain. Soon afterward, he went into a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. And as he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized on all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. This scene, I think, is important for our purposes tonight relative to, it happens again in this public space. Jesus is coming into town with a large crowd that's been following him. He comes into the small town. They're at the gates, and meeting them coming out of the town is the sort of the funeral entourage, right? The public gates are, signify certainly this public space where the elders might meet at various times. Decisions are made for the city. And so you have this encounter between Jesus and his group that's following him, and this woman and the group that's following her. And notice that Luke's account is that Jesus had compassion on her. The young man was dead, obviously, right? No need necessarily of compassion on the young man. We often look at this as a miracle of the young man. And yes, biologically speaking, it is a miracle of the young man, right? But the miracle of the young man is brought about, if you will, because of Jesus' compassion on the woman. Jesus' compassion on the woman who was widowed, meaning that the husband who would have represented her at the gates was no longer available to represent her at the gates. And this was her only son, meaning that the son who might have then at some point been able, if not already at the age of doing so, representing his mother at the gates, was also no longer there to represent his mother at the gates, right? So here is an individual in that respect, not only, I think, the compassion reflective of the sadness that she felt relative to having lost the life of her son, but her life socially and politically and economically in many respects was also at its end relative to the resources that she may have had access to, the way of life in which she would have been represented. And so Jesus restores and alleviates her own. This is not just the raising from the, a resuscitation from the dead of a young man, but this is a giving to this widow a second chance in life as well. These invite me to think then about Christology and the socio-political or the socio-economic. To what degree can we also consider the rest of the Gospel of Luke, for whom we may recall, for whom this Jesus story is situated as unfolding in the days of Tiberius Caesar and in the days of Augustus Caesar, right? So Luke's Christology, so to speak, or Luke's narration of the life of Jesus and who he was explicitly politically situated within the Roman imperial context of the first century Pax Romana. And from that perspective, and even if we look at the book of Acts as well, Acts is bookended by references to Rome. There were those visitors from Rome at Pentecost, and of course in Acts 28, Luke writes, and so we finally arrived to Rome, right? So the entire apostolic narrative also unfolds within this imperial Roman context, and therefore Luke in his 2 volumes is very conscious about telling the Jesus story and telling the apostolic story as unfolding in this particular socio-political and socio-economic frame. Now, there are certainly many other ways for us to read the third gospel, even within this context, but I think the invitation for us is to understand Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, also in relationship to the socio-political and socio-economic themes that do appear repeatedly throughout the Gospel of Luke. We turn now then to, again, each of the 3 parts will have sort of these 3 sort of moments to them as well, right? Now, I want to look at the what I call apostolic trekking in the polis. The many tongues of Acts 2, a motif that I use to keep thinking about manyness in and through the apostolic narrative, open up, I want to suggest, to many public ministerial practices. So part of what I'm trying to trace from that perspective is how do we connect, if you will, Jesus' sort of ministry within a socio-political context, socio-economic context, with apostolic ministry and mission within their socio-political and socio-economic contexts. So we'll work our way through the first few chapters of Acts at a very, very high level, very, very quickly. Acts 2, one way we might want to imagine, one way we might want to summarize this particular motif is how the early apostolic community reimagined their own economic practices, right? All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts. As the apostolic community grew from 3,000 to 5,000 in and through chapter 4, and then into chapter 5, then we're told again, another part of this narrative is repeated at the end of chapter 4 relative to the selling and the mutual sharing. I think, again, we mentioned this last night, or maybe it was 2 nights ago. There are the Gospel of Luke has many, many more references to Jesus' teaching about poverty, about wealth, and about ways in which we handle that aspect of our lives. And so I think we can draw at least some lines from those teachings to say this is one way in which the early apostolic community began to embody and live out, if you will, Jesus' teachings relative to what they saw in his life. Not the only way. Again, we'll come back in a few moments, right, and say that there are other windows in Acts that we can look at that give us, again, different perspectives on ways in which the early apostolic community and members in diverse places, would have carried their wealth or lived with their wealth or not in their poverty as well. Acts 3 then might also invite us to think about how social practices were being re-examined. So I'm thinking about the narrative, as we might recall, of Peter and John going in the 12th hour to the temple, and they encountered the man who was lame. We know the account, silver and gold have I none, but such as I have I given to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk. And his feet is strengthened, and he goes walking and leaping into the temple. Again, I think references from a Lucan perspective, drawing forth from some of the Old Testament prophetic narratives about when the Spirit is given, when the Messiah's presence unfolds and appears on the scene, then there's liberation, there's healing, there's wholeness, there's flourishing, there's thriving, right? Some of those allusions in that particular context. But I think one of the things that I want to notice relative to all this is the way in which the apostles are navigating temple life, breaking bread from home to home. They're renegotiating both their religiosity in relationship to the public space. They're renegotiating how their socioeconomic practices impinges upon their interactions with the wider economic community, and also influences the way in which they interact with the wider community. Day after day, Acts 2 tells us people were added into this community, right? So there's an ongoing dynamic, fluid intermixing, so to speak, socially and economically within this Jerusalem context in which there's from home to home, from home to temple to market, back to temple to home to market, right? You kind of imagine how all this was unfolding in this particular context. Acts chapter 4, I would then also invite us to think about how political practices are being revised. So the story, I think, as many of us might recall, after the healing of the man on the Sabbath, no doubt, Peter and John get thrown into jail overnight, and of course, then the next day they're hauled before the authorities. And a couple of the very prominent sayings in Acts 4 that we might recall, right? They were questioned about the source of their authority, by what power or by what name, did you do this? To which the response in part is, Jesus of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, there is salvation in no other name, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved. Somebody say amen. We can do that in lecture as well, right? And of course, then they were, after further deliberation, further discussion and so on, they were released and also admonished to speak no more to anyone in his name, to which the apostles responded, "Whether it is right in God's sight to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot keep from speaking about what we have seen and heard." And somebody said, amen, right? So it's an interesting, this is this public space in which the early apostolic believers are negotiating their faith in relationship to the authorities. They come back into the communal context, the early communal context, begin to worship and praise God, and they draw from Psalm 2, one of the royal psalms, right, in that particular context, which is a robustly political psalm as well. They were gathered together, and they begin to pray, right? Herod and Pontius Pilate are gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. And yet you stretched out your hand to heal, and signs and wonders are performed through the name of your holy servant Jesus. And then the passage ends by indicating how the Holy Spirit fills this apostolic group in that particular context. So the back and forth between the public and the so-called private. Now, public and private, obviously, in our particular context, is mediated through our own modernist sort of organizational frames, right? But I think what we're seeing again in Acts 2, Acts 3, Acts 4 is that the apostolic witness relative to the social, there's a fluidity between what happens in the worship space, what happens in the teaching space, what happens in the space of fellowship, and the interfaces between the outside community, interfaces with the public spaces, what we might call the public spaces of Jerusalem. So just a few summary comments relative to this first part, in which I now want to then say, what are some of the Christological or messianic implications for you and I today as we navigate the public square? How might we engage the socioeconomic theologies or socioeconomic political philosophies or socioeconomic realities of our lives today messianically? And again, I mean, there's been lots of thinking theologically about these issues. I'm just simply invited to, in this particular context, to go back to the Jesus story, reconsider how the Jesus story is also embodied in the apostolic story that it's told in light of that Jesus story, and then keep thinking about the implications for us today. In this political season, we keep hearing about it's all about the economy, right? And how would we, as faithful believers in Jesus Christ today, think about both the weightiness of that reality in so many different contexts on the one hand, but also think about that Christologically and apostolistically. You know, if you understood that, then you've got the gift of interpretation of tongues. Now somebody say amen. And my goal here in this particular context is not to promote any kind of idealistic first century apostolic communism, even though I know you here in Canada, according to what the folks in the United States tell me, are full of this sort of socialist communism, right? But again, it's what are the apostolic windows into the ways in which the first century followers of Jesus lived economically in light of Jesus' teachings about wealth and poverty, for instance. And how about also then thinking about, our political theologies in this sort of more Christoformic way? How might, again, the image, the life, and the teachings of Jesus help us to embody our interface with the political specifically? So again, the public, in my understanding, includes both the social, the economic, and the political. The political, in that respect, comes under the public, right? Again, I understand that public and private are more our constructs at a certain level, but I'm thinking particularly with respect to ecclesia, church, the apostolic community, and our interfaces with sort of, the beyond there, the social, the economic, and in this case also the political. And obviously when we think of political theologies or political theological practices, we usually think about statecraft. We think about nation states. Obviously the first century is not constituted by nation states as we are today. So we've got to keep these kinds of differences in mind, right? And we'll come in a few moments to thinking about nations in the first century from the perspective of ethnos, from the perspective of peoples. But again, as we think through all of this, the implication for me, or the invitation for me, is to how might revisiting the Jesus narrative inform a different way of existing, for instance, in relationship to empire, the Pax Romana in Jesus' case, in the apostles' case, and in our case today, in all of the different ways of understanding empire that we may have as well, in all of that complexity. And then, in that respect, right, the social, the economic, the political, how do we, from this Christological either standpoint or from this Christologically, hopefully inspired space, following Jesus' footsteps, but also in the apostolic footsteps, walk out our faith in the variety of public spaces that we might find ourselves: social spaces, economic spaces, political spaces, civic spaces, digital spaces, right? There's a variety or there are diverse domains of the public in which all of us navigate. The ongoing reminder is, are we doing it Christologically, Christo-formally, messianically, right? Following the apostles who follow Jesus in the power of the Spirit. All right, so part two, we're now shifting from the public, the social, to the ethnic, the role of ethnos in the New Testament, in the Jesus narratives particularly, and also in the apostolic narrative. And this window, I want to invite us to revisit Jesus entering the Samaritan village, which is detailed in Luke chapter 9, particularly in verse 52. But from that perspective, I want us to think about Jesus' interfaces with Samaritans more broadly, particularly as we see in the Gospels, right? The Samaritans being the ethnic other to the Jews that was most directly relevant to the Jesus story and most palpable, if you will, at one level, that's sort of within Israel, relative to the first century apostolic accounts. Now, we'll come to the ethnic other relative to beyond the Samaritans in a few moments, but for now, I want us to look particularly at Jesus' interface with Samaritans. So we're told in a couple different places that Jesus travels through rather than avoids Samaria, right? So I think this is significant in large part because I think we know that, as the Gospel of John puts it, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans, right? That's in chapter 4. That's in the account of Jesus' interface with a woman at the well, which we'll come back to in a moment. And there are harsher stereotypes and ethnically palpable sort of stereotypes. In chapter 8, there's an ethnically tinged slur that we read about. Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? This was, again, the Jews responding to Jesus' ministry, right? So things had gotten very, very, convoluted and divisive, if you will, after a few hundred years in which Samaritans were there within the Palestinian context, and there was more but also less relationship between the two. And yet Jesus, we are told, chooses to go, and on a couple of occasions, he purposefully enters into the region. In fact, in one case, he sent messengers ahead of him. This is in Luke. And on their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him, intending to stay overnight. Right? Now, interestingly, right, in this particular case, the Samaritan village, something happened in the interface and the interactions that they were, the the preparations weren't allowed to go forth. And so the disciples reacted in the way in which they might have been expected to when they wanted to call down fire on the village for being less than responsive to the overtures of wanting to settle in for the night. And Jesus rebukes them. Okay. In John chapter 4, it also says in that particular case, but he had to go through Samaria. Now, we don't, again, the historiography of these things, that happened before or after this earlier episode, or was the John 4 episode before or after? The chronologies between John and the synoptics, I'll let the Bible scholars figure that one out. I'm not sure when, again, how we read the historicity of John chapter 4 relative to all that, but my point is still the fact that it does say, John tells us that he chose to go to Samaria, through Samaria, into Samaria, and in that respect, whatever otherization between Jews and Samaritans existed in that particular time, Jesus pressed through those otherizations and sought to engage with the Samaritans. And Jesus not only sought to engage with them, but he embraced them, right? Luke 17 gives us another account. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. Now, he could have gone a longer way, he could have avoided, but again, he's going through. So in that respect, he's in this liminal space, sort of in this region between Samaria and Galilee, and not quite exactly entering into Samaritan territory, but the narrative goes on to say that when Jesus was approaching a village, he was approached by lepers, healed one of them, and one of them came back to thank him, prostrating himself before Jesus' feet. Did he prostrate himself in a way that touched Jesus' feet? There's, that's open in the narrative, right? Which suggests that, but in any case, this village, even if it was on the Samaritan side of the border, again, this is Jesus going through. There's a kind of space in which it's a liminal space, sort of between Samaria and Galilee, and Jesus interfaces with, touches, heals, embraces in that respect these lepers who were Samaritans. In John's gospel, of course, we have the famous woman at the well narrative. Jesus embraces not just Samaritan males, but this woman who the disciples express a great deal of concern about in this particular context, one who was 5 times multiply married, promiscuous one at that, possibly. Jesus treats her with dignity and respect, receives hospitality from her hands, and stays with them for 2 days. So this particular account allowed for the overnight stay that he intended in the other context. Maybe it was this account that preceded it that made him think that he could have an overnight stay later on, and it didn't really work out. But Jesus resists the ethnic otherizing between Jews and Samaritans. He resists the gender biases that would have been an intersectionally overlain upon the ethnic divisions in that particular context. And he also resisted the spiritual commitments that also had characterized some of the disagreements, right? You worship over here, we worship over there, etc. That's in John chapter 4. I think Jesus, from that perspective, I want to kind of just, again, pull on the Good Samaritan narrative, I think, which we all know. And we've talked a little bit about, the lawyer approaching Jesus saying, what must I do to attain eternal life? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, might, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor myself. And the question was, well, who's my neighbor? Again, that's where we have this account in which Jesus talks about the Samaritan, unlike the Levite and the priest and the Levite, something like that. There were 2 others who were Jews that went on the other side of the road, right? The Samaritan other, the ethnic minority, the ethnic outsider to the Jewish community, nevertheless came and had pity on this person who was on the side of the road, right? So the Samaritan other exhibited the pathic response that should have been expected of all humans. It was reflected not by the priest or the Levite, but by the Samaritan other. And in that respect, the Samaritan other enculturates this Christological commitment, this Christoformic messianic commitment of pathic, loving, compassionate response to the world. Salvation in that respect comes to the Jews, to the ethnic majority, from the ethnic minority, from the ethnically marginalized outsider. Even, in fact, in this particular account, given, again, the roadway that we're on, from the ethnic migrant minority other. Right? Salvation comes to the Jew through this othered figure. So now I want to enlarge the scope and think beyond, again, starting kind of including the Samaritan account, but now look at the book of Acts and think about apostolic migrations among the nations. And again, the word for nations in the New Testament is almost always a translation of ethnos, right? The ethnic other, the ethnically differentiated other, which from the Jewish perspective, again, I've started by locating it in an almost an intra-Jewish sense, first and foremost in relationship to the Samaritan other. But now I want to also visit it vis-a-vis the ethnic other, which are the Gentile others that are in the apostolic world. And if you think about the fact that Luke writes from a Jerusalem-centered perspective of the early apostolic community's commitments, right, then this sort of Jewish growing Gentile is the ethnic majority that's presumed in the narrative. The ethnic minorities in that respect are the Gentiles, right? So again, we've got to kind of think a little backwards, because we think about the Jewish of first century Palestinian world as a small group relative to the Roman and Gentile others. That's true. But from a narrative perspective, the apostolic community is where the gospel comes first to the Jews. And so that is the home community. And the ethnos are the other. They're minorities, not in terms of numbers, but they're minority from the perspective of commitments, from the perspective of values, if you will, from the perspective of where the center is in relationship to the margins. And so what I want to do is take just a few windows from Acts 8 and then into Acts 10. What are some of the many languages, and therefore in that respect also the many different kinds of practices that we see as the apostolic community begins to engage these ethnic others, ethnos, the nations, so to speak. Now, again, starting with the Samaritans, right, we know that Acts chapter 8 gives us what I would call a wondrously significant practices in Samaria. I'm tempted to use a more modern nomenclature called power encounters, which kind of could characterize what's going on in the Acts 8 narrative. But they were signs and wonders, right? They were miracles, they were healings, and there were exorcisms that were taking place. And Simon Magus is in the midst and trying to figure out all of these things. So I just call them wondrously significant practices. In this particular context, for this particular space and time, these certain practices were what opened up the conversation, opened up the relationship, opened up the messianic interactions with the Samaritan others. And then we step into the second half of Acts chapter 8. We have what I would call hermeneutical and baptismal practices with and for the Ethiopian eunuch. I think we're all familiar with the Ethiopian eunuch and the story there. Serving the queen as the treasurer of the queen's court, had come to Jerusalem to worship. And Philip finds himself, after having gone through Samaria, now all of a sudden trailing this eunuch in his carriage, going back home. If the Samaritan woman at the well included the gender and class dimensions, well, here with the eunuch, we have the ethnic dimension, we have, in terms of his eunuchhood, his sort of a gender and sexuality dimension. And from the perspective of how eunuchhood was understood in the first century in the ancient world, we may have something about what we would in modern times call a disability or an impairment dimension in which the encounter unfolds in. And lastly, of course, potentially probably one who was of darker skin relative to his Ethiopian identity, And so you have multiple sort of sectionalities here that are all converging in Philip's interactions with this particular individual. The angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go towards the south to the road that goes down to Jerusalem." He got up and went, and now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of the entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home. Seated in his chariot, he was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to his chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" He said, "How can I unless someone guides me?" That's the hermeneutical reference here in my poet. So he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now the passage of the scripture that he was reading was this, from Isaiah 56, I think. "Like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away." A few verses before this in the Isaianic text, there are references to eunuchs. And so you can get a sense, this is not cited here in this particular narrative, but it's there in the Isaianic passage. Who can describe his generation? Other translations, who can describe his descendants? From a biological perspective, the eunuch would not have any descendants. The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask, does this prophet say this? About himself or about somebody else?" One might imagine that Philip is discerning and listening to the eunuch, and he's attending to his own life arc and life trajectory, his testimony, the eunuch's testimony, so his witness. And Philip began to speak, and starting with the scripture, this particular text, and then, of course, in the broader context, may I dare say that Philip begins an exegesis of this Isaianic passage. He proclaimed them the good news about Jesus, re-narrating potentially the eunuch's life trajectory as following after that of the Messiah that was talked about in the Isaiah passage, right? One who did not have any physical, literal descendants, and yet at the same time, given the messianic message in Jesus of Nazareth and his life, and now this apostolic community following in the footsteps of this Messiah, who could indeed describe his generation, who could indeed describe his descendants. And so tradition might tell us that, that the Church of Ethiopia finds its origins in this eunuch, one who may not have had any biological children of his own, but one who may have had generations of descendants following after him as he followed in the footsteps of the Messiah. So as they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here's some water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? What is to prevent me from joining my witness, my testimony, my narrative with this messianic witness, this messianic testimony?" Commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them went down into the water, and Philip baptized them. Hallelujah, praise the Lord. And when they came out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and went on his way rejoicing. All right. Philip found himself outside of Azotus, and he was passing through the region. He proclaimed the good news to all until he came to Caesarea. Okay. So, hermeneutical practices, baptismal practices, different practices for different ethnic contexts, different ethnic missional environments, so to speak. And of course, we have Acts 10, like what I call fellowship or meal practices with those from every nation and ethnicity in their heaven, and okay, gathered from every nation in heaven. That's Acts 2, right? Starting in Acts 8 and into Acts 10, we have then the narrative, the apostolic narrative, open up from Jerusalem, chapters 2 to 5 to 6, 2 to 3, to Judea, 4 and 5 and 6, into Samaria, chapter 8, and to the ends of the earth, starting in second half of 8 and into 10 and through Acts 28, right? So what are the fellowship or meal practices? Again, think about Peter's visions about the unclean animals that were let down, and 3 times it occurred to him to rise and eat, kill and eat, and he says, "No, I'm not going to eat anything unclean." And that's what then leads him to open, or that prepares him to open the door, welcome Cornelius' servants, listen to them, entertain their the conversation, follow them to Cornelius's home, cross the threshold and enter into Cornelius's space, listen to Cornelius, interact with Cornelius, and then fellowship with Cornelius. Precisely the thing that he had indicated that as a pure messianic follower, that was inappropriate, right? And of course, we know from the apostolic narrative that Peter says in the middle of Acts chapter 10, God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. Cornelius is described as a righteous one in Acts 2 and I think Acts 22, a couple times indicated to be a righteous one, right? Even before he's heard the gospel, which from a Pauline perspective makes you wonder about really what's going on here. But I'll let the Pauline person answer that particular question later on. So there's meal fellowship, there's entering into and realization of righteousness that allows for this kind of messianic fellowship to unfold in this particular context. Okay, so now we can go on through the rest of the book of Acts, but again, these are just windows for me to keep thinking about the ethnoi and how the apostolic community is engaging with that. So for me, I think from that perspective, I want to just say a few summary comments at the end of this part too. If the first part of this concluding lecture was focused on the social and the public dimension, and this part is focused on this ethnic dimension, and I throw the word nationalism in here because, again, the New Testament and the translations that we have sort of collapse the ethnic and the nation, right? So, I mean, the invitation is, I think, for us to go beyond ethnocentrism, and in that respect, beyond nationalism, which maybe, well, I don't know how it is here in Canada, but you know, we're having a lot of the conversations in the United States right now about nationalism. I'll start with just a couple sort of summary comments relative to where we're at. Thinking about theologies of the ethnic invite us to also continue to rethink theologies of culture. At Fuller Seminary, where I teach, there was a fair, we've had a school of world mission, a missiological school since 1965. In the 70s and into the 80s, there was a group of missiologists at Fuller Seminary that really popularized what's called the homogeneous unit principle, in which they invited us to think about how the church should be planted and grows most effectively when it is constituted, local ecclesial communities, that is constituted by people who have similar cultures, ethnicities, or languages. And yeah, I mean, there's a certain sense in which, ethnically based ecclesial communities are very natural from a certain point of view, and I might even say that in any particular context, it may be appropriate and very appropriate to have what we might call a homogeneous unit principle, activated in a particular, as a particular missional church planning and related strategy for engaging with mission and the community in any particular context, right? But I think that, sacralizing this so that it impedes an ethnic group, a cultural group, from realizing the trans-ethnic, transcultural, and translingual ecclesia. That's where some of the problems might begin to emerge. And from that particular perspective, it's important to hold to a Christic vision of the embrace of many peoples, tribes, ethnicities, and languages of this world, as what we see in the apocalypse in terms of the vision that's invited us to, right? That vision doesn't, because of the languages, right, it doesn't eliminate the distinctiveness, the particularities of each ethnos, or the distinctiveness and particularity of each language group. I'm intrigued, for instance, when I know that here in Canada, I've heard about the Quebecans and their holding on to the French. I think someone was explaining that to me a little bit before, right? And so how does a nation sort of grapple with that kind of multilingualism, I think is an important way in which we continue to think about these things, even theologically, Christologically, and ecclesiologically as well. And obviously, even within that particular context, think, as we all know, there are numerous First Nations groups and languages across Canada. Certainly there are in terms of Native American communities in the United States that are also in the mix, right? How do we think theologically, Christologically, pneumatologically, and ecclesiologically about the church with all of that, again, trans-ethnic, transcultural, and translinguistic diversity? Also from that perspective, I want to say a few words from from this ethnos springboard about needing to challenge theologies of race, of racism, and of racialization, particularly in our time now in late modernity after colonialism. The importance of speaking out on behalf of the ethnically minoritized other. So again, if you think about Jesus speaking from the Jewish-centered perspective, talking about the Samaritans in the ways that he did, right? He opens up to the possibilities of the Samaritan other being less marginal and brought more into the center. Or he opens up a pathway for the dominant Jewish majority and the minority Samaritan ethnic community for more dialogue, for more interface, for more mutuality, for more reciprocity. That's, I think, the invitation for us. Now, today, obviously, depending on where you're at, you may or may not be part of the dominant ethnic group, right? In any particular context, the dominant it could be different, right? What's dominant in one context could be a minority in another context. In this particular instance, I think the principle that I'm looking at here is situating the apostolic approach to the other, even though, again, they're the minority people in the Gentile world of the first century. Their worldview centers their Jewish narrative, the God of Israel at the center. From that centered point of view, they're now opening and being opened up to and being transformed by the ethnic minorities, so to speak, the ethnic others, so to speak, in that respect. Minorities, again, not necessarily from a numbers perspective, but from the perspective of the community that it's attempting to negotiate those differences, right? So in that respect, Jesus and the apostolic community invite us to be in solidarity with the ethnic other, the racial other, the racialized other, recognizing our own racialization in all of that, invites us to be advocates on behalf of, like Jesus was, and invites us also potentially to resist when our ethnocentrism is debilitating. To the point where, from Jesus' perspective, the dominant Jewish perspective not only learns from, not only is touched by and received by the other, but receives salvation through the ministry of the other, right, in the Good Samaritan, where the injured person is saved through the Samaritan's intervention. So thinking about racialization in that respect invites us to identify where's the majority in any particular context, and how do we as the church, situated within or on the margins of that majority, then negotiate the kinds of privileges that the majority has relative to some of these apostolic principles. And then finally, redirecting ethnocentrism or nationalism. Again, nationalism is a modern term based on modern nation state, but certainly redirecting, from that first century, redirecting ethnocentrism from the first century perspective, and then redirecting nationalism Christologically and with regard to hospitality. Theologies of the ethnic in the New Testament open up to thinking about theologies of nations, theologies of ethnos in relationship to nations. Not a Christian nationalism, but a Christian vision of and practical embrace of, again, the many peoples, tribes, ethnicities, and languages of this world. One that seeks out the ethnic, racial, cultural, linguistic other, like Jesus with Samaria and the Samaritans, and embraces the other in our arms, which presumes an openness of hearts and a dispositional attunement of minds and affections. Here is where the walls between Jews and Gentiles are broken down within the walls that are erected from the center to the outside world, from the Jewish center to the Greek outsider, so to speak. This is then, in that respect, inviting us to rethink Christologically and from the standpoint of hospitality, the ethnic other, right? Now, so the ethnic majority is invited to this posture of hospitality, this posture of welcome, this posture of being vulnerable to it as being hosts in this particular context. I'll turn to the guests in a few moments and a little bit here. All right, I need to finish up here. But we're finally getting to the religious other, which is the meatiest part. So let's see what we can do to Jesus and the religious other being impressed upon by the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman. So Mark's version, let's start with a Markan, assuming a kind of Markan priority. Mark portrays the Syrophoenician woman first and foremost geographically and secondly as a Hellenist. So there's a language issue. From this perspective, one could read the Syrophoenician woman really as in terms of ethnos, right? Going back to the part we just looked at. The interactions of Jesus here are fairly straightforward. She begged him to cast a demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair for the children's food to take the food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go, the demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying in bed, and the demon was gone. Much shorter account. Matthew casts this in terms of as a Canaanite woman, not as a person of Syrophoenician or regional situatedness. The Canaanite language has a lot more, not just ethnic, but cultural, even religious connotations to it. Situates it within the scheme of Tyre and Sidon, which are outsider cities in the Old Testament world, relative then also to now the first century apostolic narrative, right? And there's pronouncements of woe on these outside worlds. Now, in the Matthew version, in the Markan version, it says this happened in a house at which Jesus sought refuge from the crowds, and she finds him in this house. So in the Markan version, it's a much more, if you will, private context within which Jesus encounters this woman from another region. In the Matthew version, it says that she pursues him to the outskirts of town and to the wider region, so it's a much more public interface, and even strains and shouts. So watch for the interactions, right? She's shouting after him in this open space, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples then intervene and urge him, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." Well, she's kind of persistent, right? And he answered, now, the disciples were intervening. It says he answered. He's answering them. He's not responding to her. He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she caught up to him. That's my editorializing. And knelt before him saying, "Lord, help me." So the first time she addressed him, she was sort of yelling after him from a distance. She catches up to him. He kind of has ignored her up until this time. And he catches up to him and kneels before him and says, "Lord, help me." He answers now to her, "It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." And she persists a third time, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." Okay? So Jesus, I put it here learning from, but Jesus' mind gets changed, right? Based upon his initial answer to the disciples, I wasn't called to minister to her in this particular case. And then through her persistence and through her ongoing interactions with him, Jesus learns from, or his mind is changed by, this cultural, ethnic, and pagan other. I think that gives us a good window into thinking about the ways in which this interaction with this Canaanite woman sort of sets the stage for the broader Matthean platform to then say, go into all the world, right? The world has come after Jesus in the form of this Canaanite woman, engaging him to the point of changing his mind in that particular instance, and it sets up the story for the larger mission to the Gentiles in the rest of the story. Real quickly through the apostolic witness amidst the pluralistic peace of Rome, I would say the way I'm looking at this now is through another lens of many different religious doctrinal systems and how that invites a variety of interpretive practices as we go through some of these narratives. I'm pulling together Acts 14 and 19 in part because I wanted to keep 3 bullets in each case on each screen, and so what you're going to get is 3 bullets, but really this is 4 bullets, Yeah, but I'm calling this Christology, natural theology, and interreligious dialogical praxis, right? A kind of praxis that is interpretive, that is based upon a certain set of understandings that then motivate and generate a certain form of discursive interaction with the world. In Lystra, in Acts chapter 14, there's an episode where, the crowd saw what Paul had done, shouted in Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. The priests of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates. He and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifice. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard about it, they tore their clothes and rushed into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this?" I wonder if they were speaking Lycaonian. "We are mortals just like you. And we bring you good news that you turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the past generation, he allowed all the nations to follow, all ethnos, to follow ethnic groups, to follow their own ways. And yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons and filling you with food and your hearts with joy." Okay, so connecting the sort of the natural blessings of life in the world to the God that they thought they were, or another image of God, inviting them to consider that image of God relative to these blessings that that we all enjoy. Even with these words, they could scarcely restrain the crowds from offering a sacrifice to them. Okay. Some have argued that this sort of natural theological approach that is less specific about Jesus Christ, is not carried out as much else in the rest of the apostolic narrative. But now I want to go to Acts 19 for just a quick moment. This is now in Ephesus. The scene unfolds over a number of years, right? So Paul is in dialogue or teaching and arguing or debating or discussing in the lecture hall of Tyrannus for a couple of years in this particular context. In this particular context, there is also some exorcisms, the 7 sons of Sceva, and then there's this whole ruckus that breaks out in Ephesus relative to how the gospel and its growth was impacting some of the religious sales relative to the goddess Artemis. If you remember that particular story, okay? So a crowd starts rushing in, people get all really excited about things, and a riot ensues. And over 2 hours of a riot. You got 2 years of conversation, now you got 2 hours of riot in this particular text. Interestingly here, the charge was that Paul and his colleagues were saying that gods are made with hands are not gods, with direct reference to some of the things that they were making that were not selling as well anymore in that particular context. Now, that could have reference in earlier, a couple places, including in Acts 14, where, Paul, in the Acts 14 passage I read to you a few moments ago, talks about these worthless things, right? And so there's clearly indications in various parts of the book of Acts that Paul talks about the gods of ancient Greek and Rome in these pejorative ways. But that language isn't present in the Acts narrative, in the Ephesus narrative. But instead, what you have here, the town clerk quieted the crowd. This is the guy that came in at the very last minute and saved the scene here. He said, "Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You have brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess." And with that, he then dismisses the crowd. I've always found that to be a very intriguing reference to the way in which Paul, for 2 years in Ephesus, potentially he could have said a lot of quote-unquote blasphemous things against Artemis. But the town clerk's witness and his capacity to disperse the crowd called out the fact that that wasn't done. right? So finding a way to engage in a religiously plural context in a way that doesn't speak badly of or antagonistically in that direct way, I think is also another interesting window into the apostolic dialogical posture. Dialogue is possible, debate is possible, apologetics is possible, 2 years in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, and yet at the same time, no need to blaspheme the reigning goddess in the eyes of the local people. Acts 17 gives us what I would call an initial comparative theological praxis, right? So real quickly here, I think we know this account in Acts 17. This is at the Areopagus. We know here that Paul, in talking about, from one ancestor he has made all nations inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he's not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, we too are his offspring. And then Paul goes on to call for repentance. He's referring in this case to Aratus, a 3rd century Greek Sicilian poet or philosopher. And now Paul, however, is reinterpreting Erastus's perceived pantheism as part of his theological homily with regard to God, the creator of heaven and earth. So an initial window into what I would call an early 1st century Pauline comparative theological approach. Now, comparative theology itself is certainly, has gone through the modern version of it over the last 150 years, has gone through 3 or 4 iterations, and we are doing things in that respect, have grown in our ability to engage the otherness of other traditions, but yet I think in a way that is both consistent with and yet also differentiated from, I think, some of what we might see here in Acts chapter 17. The last window I want to look at is what I call interfaith hospitality, and I want to go now to the Maltese context in Acts 28. So we have the shipwreck, where Paul washed up on the island. He encounters the barbarians, the Maltese islanders, who are called Barbaroi, in Acts 28, verse 2. And these pagans, these barbarians, these natives showed us unusual kindness. Since it had begun to rain and was cold, they kindled a fire and welcomed us all around it, number 1. Number 2, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Number 3, they bestowed many honors upon us, and when they were about to sail, they put on board all the provisions we needed. 3rd time's a charm, right? So who's the host and who's the guest in this case, right? The hosts are the barbarians. The guests are the missionaries, so to speak. Who receives salvation in this case? The guests at the hands of the hosts. No mention of evangelism here in any kind of clear, charismatically articulated sort of exchange. The only thing that we know that is said is in verse 8, where it talks about Publius' father getting sick, and it says Paul prayed for him and he was healed. Okay? So an evangelistic prayer at best, at least as far as Luke's account goes, right? So interfaith hospitality addresses not only us as hosts to welcome the other, but challenges us to be guests in the presence of the cultural, ethnic, and in this case also the religious others. And of course we can unpack from there, the story of what happens with the church at Malta now over 2,000 years. Okay, we're going to wrap up here. Encountering religious others, remapping Christopraxis for a world of many faiths. We start with what I would call Christological ontic exclusivism, right? There's no other name under heaven by which we are saved. So there is a clear Jesus-centrism of our faith that is in that Jesus centricity exclusive. I call it an ontic exclusivism in the sense that that's what it means to be a Christian, to be committed to Jesus, as far as I'm concerned. That's the facticity of our commitments to Him. The facticity of that commitment, that set of commitments, is an exclusivist one. It's not the kind of exclusivist one that leads us to any kind of what I would call an arrogant assurance that we might think or know that we own the copyright on what it means, let's say, even to be saved. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many deeds of power in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Go away from me, you evildoers. Gives us all pause about whatever we might think in our exclusivism we might be acting or doing. I'm much more interested in how we live out our faith in the public square and how our posture, our affectivity toward our neighbors of other faiths does not require us to deny that there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we might be saved. But I'm more concerned with how then we might act and behave to and with these neighbors that might enable reception of and participation in God's redemptive work. I then also invite us to think about what I call a Christoform epistemic inclusivism, right? Yes, on the one hand, the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few there be that find it. Yet on the other hand, there's great multitudes of those from many nations, tribes, tongues, and peoples gathered around the throne. God, in God's fairness, will God in God's fairness will be the final judge from that sort of post-mortem eschatological perspective. Today, however, might this same Spirit who anointed Jesus also be the breath of life that binds us to other human creatures of any or of no faith in ways that allows us to further recognize the fruits of that divine wind in their testimonies and witnesses, right? A conversation that could ensue, like between Philip and the eunuch, like between Paul and those at Areopagus, and in other ways. Might we find others as well, like Jesus and the Samaritans, walking together along the road, receiving and giving hospitality to one another in that respect, holding forth God's own mercies and grace, and are recognizing our limited understanding, and therefore in that respect open to growing and learning with others in a world of many faiths. Finally, I want to invite us to think about what I would also call a Christocentric praxeological universalism. Not a soteriological universalism in the sense that I certainly we're not in any position to say who or how many or all or the devil or whatever is going to be saved. Speculative eschatology for speculative theologians. Tonight and for this moment, I'm a practical theologian. A Christocentric praxeological universalism invites us into a posture of engagement, one that follows after the footsteps of Jesus, interacts and learns from the Syrophoenician or Canaanite pagan other, one that goes into all the world to both proclaim the gospel but also to receive hospitality of those who would be welcoming to us in any particular context. Those from every tongue, tribe, and nation will bring forth their gifts into the New Jerusalem, as well as the end of Revelation tells us. So we're on this cosmic journey together on this planet with people of every and no other faith. Salvation being looked to in the hands of God, but invited to follow along in his pathway by the Spirit. As Jesus himself said, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must also bring them, and they will listen to my voice, so there will be one flock, one shepherd. What does he mean? How do we understand these mysterious references? That's part of the journey, following in the footsteps of Jesus, receiving from the religious other, from the Samaritan other, just like Jesus in Matthew 25 talks about how those who are the sheep were those who went to visit those in prison and clothed the naked and fed the hungry and gave water to the thirsty, right? Because they were serving Jesus in that particular context. And in that respect, receiving from that other, unbeknownst to them. The sheep are not religiously named. They're simply being kind to those that are in need. In the process of them dispensing salvation, they are recipients also of God's salvific embrace. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions. Or y'all just mulling that one over. Yep, Melody?
Thank you so much. You talked a bit about those of other faiths, and I believe that you stated that Jesus learned from the pagan other. And I wonder today how Christians might learn from non-Christians.
I think the first thing we would probably need to do is to be open to even entertaining some kind of relationship with others, whatever those others are, right? And yeah, in this case, we're talking specifically about the religious others, but yeah, the ethnic other, the cultural other, the linguistic other. It might be a little bit more difficult if we don't understand what they're saying. Pray for the gift of interpretation of tongues, I suppose, is one thing. But the point is that oftentimes we are, we organize our lives in ways that do not open up possibilities for that kind of meeting, for that kind of encounter, and then for that kind of conversation, so to speak, even, right? And by conversation, I'm not meaning only verbal, but the kind of togetherness that will open up a relationship in whatever way. And I think, that's the first step, and from that particular perspective, how we then learn will unfold relative to how the relationship unfolds, right? And the deeper that we come to know the other as the other, I think in that respect, the more we might be surprised about the other's perspective, the other's experiences, the other's commitments, how they might inform us, challenge us in some respects, and who knows, that conversation might also allow for opportunities in which things we might have to share, verbally or otherwise, can also have a similar kind of accompaniment or interrogative dimension to it. So a real relational conversation, I think, opens up all kinds of possibilities about how, we grow. We grow in life's journey. It's kind of a more general level of response, right? But yeah, as we, again, as the relationships grow, do we start reading together? Do we start entering into, I often think about how, yes, on the one hand, we invite religious others or any others to come into our spaces of worship. What if we were to be invited to the other space of worship, whatever that might be, right? How would we approach that invitation? How would we respond to that invitation? How do we approach it? How do we then carry it out? And again, how we do all those things will in part determine to what degree we might be able to learn from those kinds of experiences. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the lecture. It's been very good. My question is based on your closing statement. You mentioned about, you quoted a scripture from Jesus where he said that I have other sheep that are not from this flock, that I'll have to bring them in as well.
Yeah.
To make them one with this flock, right? So I was thinking, and my question is this, does it in any way validate an argument for pluralism? And then that's one of it. And the second one is, how does it affect the Great Commission towards the other faiths as Christians?
Yeah, it's great. So I think that's kind of a mysterious reference, right? And Jesus could just well be referring to the Greeks. I mean, there's another part in, I think it's, let's see, this one was 10. In John 12, I think, there was some indication that the disciples were wondering, I think it's in John 12, if I'm not mistaken, about whether or not Jesus was going to go hide out among the Greeks or something like that, right? And so these are some of the intriguing references in John. And could well be just the Greeks, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's a certain sense in which obviously, couple things. One, there's a clear, Yahweh monotheism in ancient Israel, and the others are no gods or false gods. And so from that perspective, That's clear at one level. At another level, it's also the case that I think we today particularly tend to bifurcate or tend to compartmentalize, let's say, the religious other from the ethnic other, from the cultural other, and so on and so forth, right? In other words, there's a certain sense in which everything that I've said here, I've kind of used three windows, a social window, on the one hand, an ethnic window on the second hand, and then a sort of a religious window on the third hand. And while in any one particular case, we might be able to sort of tease out and differentiate between how each one of these windows might inform identities of individuals, and one might be prominent and one might be diminished. Yet at the same time, the reality is that all of these, in some respects, work together, right? And so only in kind of an abstract way can we talk about religious others as if they were only religious others and not a whole different kind of others, right? And so from that perspective, yeah, what does other sheep mean? And how do we talk about that otherness either only in religious or in all the other kinds of other ways in which that might be, right? So it might well be that the other sheep being referred to here is even more dazzling and more expansive than our various categories might even be able to sort of try to follow up after on the one hand. I might have lost your question here. So if you want to come back again to me, I'm happy to see if I can pick up, give it a bit more.
Yeah, I was asking if that validates pluralism, and then also how do we approach the Great Commission to the to other faiths?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, yes. If we go back to this slide, right? What does it mean to bear witness? Whether it is to the religious other or to simply, to of all nations, of all ethnos, right? So, from all of those perspectives, yes, I think that there is an invitation for us as Jesus followers to bear that witness in multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, if we want to use that category. Again, race is a more modern construct here. Multilingual, multi-religious world, right? In some contexts, that religious dimension is going to be foremost in the particular missional engagement. In other contexts, it's going to be the cultural. In third context, it's going to be a class issue. So the point is that while all of those may be involved in any particular context, sometimes one of those domains or dimensions emerges up to the fore, and then we engage more directly in that particular space. So from all of those perspectives, I would say that there's a sense in which Christian witness always unfolds publicly in this, we call it multi-intersectional, multi-dimensional manner. And sometimes we address the religious differences in a more direct and prioritized manner, right? So from that perspective, and I think that's what I've tried to do tonight, as we read through the Jesus narrative and then as we read through the apostolic narrative, then we can take each particular text and we could tease out these various sort of dimensions that may be discernible. An ethnic dimension, a cultural dimension, a philosophical or religious dimension, or a class dimension, or economic dimension. And we can see then now many, many different windows in the apostolic narrative in which any one of those dimensions are interfaced with differently in different parts of the apostolic narrative. Right? So it gives us, what I've tried to say here is many different repertoires, or many different missional postures, or many different witnessing approaches, or many different testimonial possibilities. So there's not necessarily one way. Sometimes, it could be as straightforward as, when Paul was, on Mars Hill, that part I didn't read, he very clearly said these, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but early up, before the bottom of Acts chapter 17, very clearly addressing, he was saddened by the fact that he saw all of these worshiping practices that were going on, right? And he begins to address that at that level, right? But then when you get to the end of Acts 28, you see that other more, what I call more comparative tone. So I think my point would be, I don't think that there's any one practice, if we master it, that we've solved it, right? I think that the apostolic narrative invites us to imagine a variety of different practices suitable to different contexts and different times, addressing different issues in different moments. And I think that's, I mean, some might say that's a little bit more confusing. It's, just tell me 1 or 2 or 3 things to do. But maybe it's liberating.
Just thinking about your classification and engagement with Jesus and social. Just wondering just like to hear your reflections maybe, and kind of where you would place his actions, excuse me, in cleansing the temple. So this kind of prophetic, civil disobedience, almost protest kind of structure.
Yeah.
I'd just be interested to hear kind of your reflections on that part in the social dynamic of engagement.
Well, thank you. I'm trying to think if I've ever written anything about that, and I can't remember. Which doesn't necessarily mean that I haven't. I just can't remember right now. So I think my initial response, so thank you for inviting that question. My initial response would be, the temple being that religious space is the classic, if you will, at least for me as a reader and as a contemporary Jesus follower, is the classic rebuke or the classic potential rebuke of me being too assured or set in my own practices, my own set of commitments, my own way of doing things, right? Always being open to being disrupted by a new word of Jesus. I think that would be. You want? Why did you ask? I mean, why?
I had recently preached through the passage, and I just find Jesus' actions in there prophetic in nature, of course, against the temple, but against the entire political economic system. And it just, it has led me to wonder, how then should we as Christians engage in public disobedience or protest or in kind of in those social spheres, and if this is an example of how we should engage, because him doing those, oversetting the temples achieved nothing except for disrupting them for a few hours. They were probably set back up immediately and business carried on, but it was still important for him to do it. So.
I really like that. Thanks. I mean, there's that socioeconomic dimension to that activity. So again, here's another example of a particular pericope or a particular aspect of the narrative that is multi-layered and many domains of the public that are sort of all wrapped up. The inside and outside is very indistinguishable here, right? The temple is a sort of an insider space, but yet there are these multiple. So I really love that. This he's the sound guy. It looks like that's what it looks like to me, And every night the sound guy's got this like really penetrating question. I mean, it's like
I listened very closely.
You don't expect that from the sound guy,
Everybody misunderestimates the sound guy.
I was wondering whether I should brace myself with the sound guy tonight,
He's not an ordinary sound guy, okay? Well, just to follow up a little bit on the engagement in social space, I really love the way that you characterize the unique as a character of liminality in Acts 8. And you highlighted that, well, we have lots of issues here: disability, gender, or sexuality even, ethnicity, and also power. And he's also displaced, right? He's away in foreign land from its powerful region or empire.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, and it makes me think that when it comes to the issue of sexuality, especially when the unique is, in this case, very unique. He's really crossing several boundaries, and he's crossing the boundaries of sexuality. This is very obvious. I wonder, to what extent, can our Christian or Christologically informed response be when it comes to this very contexted contested issue in the public space. Yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you. My theological method, Christological method, pneumatological method, functions both descriptively and normatively, right? There's a certain sense in which the descriptive dimension of it, I think, is just as powerful in many respects, because the descriptive dimension allows us to see a variety of possibilities of ways in which these things are being engaged. As I've tried to, I think, try to lift up, throughout the last few days, right? So it's certainly the case that, from that perspective, that, sexuality questions and issues have been negotiated, argued, painfully in many instances, in all kinds of ways, right? Sort of holding forth or holding strongly in some instances to more traditional notions and definitions. Others, perhaps opening up to a more, one could say, a welcoming, affirming, inclusive posture. And then across in the middle space, all kinds of diverse negotiations and wrestlings and grapplings. I appreciated the conversation over dinner with Spencer and with Melody about what was happening in the CABC, and thinking through how are Baptists and then thinking the intriguing aspects of congregational autonomy and denominational relationship and pastoral credentialing, and then you've got this theological issue that we're all trying to navigate, but in this particular context there's 3, 4, 5 different dimensions of it that are all mutually intertwining, but yet in this particular space opens up a different kind of possible conversation that another space will not open up, right? Because of the differentiatedness within which these particular factors come together in the CAC. Something, yeah.
Something.
I must be getting tired on the third night, or something like that. Maybe it's after 8:30, it's time to go home, but,
You should ask the sound guy.
yeah, there we go. And so I'm staying primarily descriptively in that respect, because from a normative standpoint, and of course the descriptive and the normative, it's always a fine line here, right? Somebody's normativity in one particular context is another person's descriptive movement in a different context, right? And so on the one hand, I think that my approach allows for at least that kind of initial idealistic differentiation. And of course, it keeps bleeding over because, again, I've had some students that have taken what I've done and gone ahead and made a particular argument relative to an open and affirming kind of position. I'm part of a denomination that is, fairly traditionalistic in that particular respect, and so that's where my own ecclesial commitments have put me at this particular point in time, right? But I think, we're having conversations, arguments, dialogues, and it'd be interesting to see, whether or not, how Athena fits in the mix at the end of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Yong. I was just thinking of a few things. The first thing, Jesus cursing the fig tree, and then Jesus leaving the 99 sheep behind to find the one. So is he putting the 99 in danger to find the one? And from your sermon today, you were preaching about Jesus claiming that he's the way, the truth, and the life, his exclusivity, right? So maybe we can put it in a secular culture, but in a culture which is not secular, which is strongly religious, how can we take this theology there? And and you also you stressed on the point today during the sermon that they will throw you out of synagogue. So do we need to be politically correct or politically righteous?
You only get one question, man. Right? After the first one, the fig tree. The rest of them, I should.
We've been bottling this up over the last 3 lectures or something.
Yeah, I know. Just. Yeah. I should have taken notes on these questions. Okay, so this has got to be the last set of questions, right? No, okay. Should we be politically correct or politically righteous? Yeah. 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 Right? And yes. And yes. And sometimes the yes and yes means the yes and no, and sometimes the yes and yes means the no and the yes, and sometimes the yes and the yes means the no and the no. Right? I think I come back to context. What does the context invite in this particular moment on both of those questions? And whether or not one has to answer both of them together, or one has to answer one of them at that particular context, or maybe in any particular context, neither one of those questions are the right questions at that particular point. So that's one way of getting out of that one. Okay, let's see here. Claiming the way, truth, and life in a religious context. Yeah. So, yeah, I've spent a lot of, I used to spend a lot more time thinking about this, actually, the first 10 years after my PhD. It's pretty much all I thought about, right? And in some respects, I know I'm Pentecostal, but I kind of like Barth on this also a little bit. So for Barth, it's the abolition of religion. So we reify or essentialize religiosity, whereas what Jesus comes is to redeem, right? So I can apply that in some respects, that redemption allows for what is good and true and holy in any context. And it could be a religious context, to be redeemed, to be fulfilled in Christ. And from this sort of Barthian perspective, it also then allows us not to reify our own institutional religiosity as Christians, right? To hold that institutional religiosity with the same level of openness as we are then invited to hold the religiosity of others with a similar openness, right? I'm calling on Barth in some respects here, but I've developed my own sort of the many tongues. Tongues in this case then invite thinking about discursive practices. Discursive practices we can think in terms of cultural, we can think in terms of linguistic, in terms of modern knowledge schemes, we can think in terms of disciplines. And again, each one of these are different windows into what a set of discursive practices are. So the capacity of any discursive practice to name a particular way of being in and do and accomplish certain things in the world, and the discourse that undergirds that builds on that explores that, and so on and so forth, right? So from that perspective, that's how I also lower the temperature on the religions, because again, when we say the religions, all of a sudden we made a noun out of them, including like Christianity, right? And wanting therefore to hold whatever our Christianity might be relative to, and this is the pietists. I don't know if, there's a lot of Baptist pietists around. I don't know how you guys situate yourself with regard to the pietists, but the Pentecostals certainly that I come from are very much pietistic, right? And in that respect, holding the relationship with Jesus to be central, and all of the trappings of the institutional dimensions of that religiosity can hold it with a little bit more openness, right? 99 in danger and the fig tree.
The 99 weren't left in danger. The assumption would be that shepherds are watching them.
Thank God for the deed, man. The fig tree. Yeah, so this thing with Jonah is interesting, right? This narrative of how he was sitting under this tree and he got shade from it. And then you've got the cattle. What is there? There's like a lot of cattle there at the very end. How many cattle? Was there a name, a number? All the cattle, Then you got you got the fish. You can have a field day with all the agency of the cattle and the fish and the fig tree. Go talk to this guy. Yeah.
Well, speaking of talking to this guy, my esteemed dean gets the final question.
Yeah, it's really more of a comment, and I wonder if we need to think about it. You use Christopraxis, Christo, a bunch of things. You like those, which is, we all
It's my
know. I think it's
Christology right
great.
here,
It's
you know?
great.
I mean,
Yeah. So you talked about the Acts 28 story on Malta. I just this week I submitted an essay to Melody talking about that, and it got me wondering if we need a new word. And I'm going to make one up now. So this might be, but maybe it already exists, and then I'll feel very deflated. But I wonder about something, and I'm looking at the Greek. I'll explain the word. But Christolampsis. So lampsis is the noun to mean receiving, because Paul receives hospitality, and in many of those examples, for Jesus receives things, and so often when we talk about theology, hospitality, and using the word praxis, it's almost always about doing.
Yeah.
It places us in the doing.
yeah.
But this would force us to see Jesus as receiver, and therefore, what does it mean to receive well, or in an orthodox way, as it were? So just something to think about. If you steal it, at least footnote me. It'd be good. But
Yeah.
that's just a comment.
Thank you.
There you go. Please put your hands together and thank Dr. Yong for this stimulating evening. Also, can I get you to unplug that? Because we will then unveil our next Hayward lecturer.
Ooh.
For next year, we have Dr. Walter Moberly, The Bible in an Ideological Age. So mark your calendars. We are going to have more stimulating discussions a year from now with our next Hayward lecturer in 2025. So again, thank you. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for attending online. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Yong. So have a good night, everybody.